Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud to rise in this House and speak to this bill and to give my honourable colleagues the actual history of what went down around safe drinking water and why we are here today. This bill is supposed to be the result of the consultations that happened as a result of the horrific E. coli contamination in Saskatchewan in 2005. I was there in Saskatchewan in 2004 and 2005 when we were trying to deal with the federal Liberal government at the time, warning them about the water crisis and the fact that there were no water standards on reserve, and that the fact that there was no water standards on reserve was a perfect get-out-of-jail card for the then Liberal government. With my dear friend Jack Layton, who was leader of the party at the time, we visited the Saskatchewan water treatment plant because the community was concerned. Number one, there was no real training in any of those communities for maintaining of water safety. Also, the equipment was completely breaking down. Jack and I saw pumps that were being held together with duct tape. They were using boards to hold up supports. And of course, when the E. coli broke out in November 2005, the response, so there were two departments here. There was one, the Department then of Indian Affairs, that completely ignored this, because the reason they ignored it, because they didn't want to spend the money, because within the capital budgets of Indian Affairs then and now, they're always using money to put out a fire here, there, or anywhere, so they ignore actual health and safety issues. But the other department that has a key role to play here is Health Canada. And Health Canada has continually, over the years, left people at risk if it means spending any money. So when E. coli was found in the water system in Saskatchewan, Health Canada's response was the rubber stamp that they respond every single time First Nations are put at risk. They say, boil your water. We've had communities that have been on boiled water advisory 5, 6, 7, 10 years running. In this case of Saskatchewan, they actually have the nerve within Health Canada to tell people that the solution for E. coli was just boil your water. It was like telling them, the families, well, bathe your children in toilets if you know, that would be the similar thing. Now, let's put this in context. This was in Ontario, which was ground zero of the biggest E. coli scandal in Canadian history that was a direct result of basically the front line of this government bench, who were then under the Harris Conservatives and the Common Sense Revolution, and the Walkerton E. coli scandal that shocked people and changed water standards in every community in Ontario except on reserve. What happened on reserve, those people were left completely on their own. So we were in Ontario with a major E. coli outbreak, and the federal and provincial governments fought back and forth for about 2 to 3 weeks about what they were going to do, because they were actually, as unfortunately happens whenever we have a crisis in one of our communities, they just hope that the people stop complaining and it'll go away. Well, it didn't. The James Bay Medical Authority came up, and the James Bay Medical Authority under Dr. Murray Trussler took pictures of children. And it was the pictures of the children in Saskatchewan in 2005 that shocked not just this nation, but it went around the world. We were faced with a full evacuation of the community of Saskatchewan because the entire infrastructure had collapsed. At that time, I was working with the then opposition critic, Jim Prentice. And I'll always say I have a great deal of respect for Jim Prentice, not just because he's from Timmins and he comes from the famous Prentice brothers hockey family. But Jim was deeply concerned. And when this present Conservative government came in, we had an Indian Affairs minister who took his file seriously and had a level of competence that you could disagree with, but you knew here was a man who took this seriously. And Jim Prentice said, we need to deal with the water situation on reserves because it was appalling. And Jim knew that one of the problems was there was absolutely no standards. So without any standards, anything could happen. So as the Conservatives are claiming now, there was a consultation process that went in place. But fast forward to today, to a bill that was brought through the unelected, unaccountable Senate. This bill is not the result of the consultations that took place with First Nation communities across Canada. This bill is something completely else. It really speaks to how far down this government has gone in terms of its willingness to be accountable to Canada's most vulnerable population, which is on our First Nation communities. This bill is basically a bill that has a lot of window dressing on language about water quality, but it is about the transferring of liability onto communities that do not have the resources to maintain adequate water safety standards. And, you know, of course, there's always this underlying, you know, the dog whistle to the conservative base that, geez, we have to bring in these standards to make sure that these people actually bother to look after their own communities, as if the communities haven't been calling out for years for what they need, which is the dollars and the infrastructure to maintain proper water treatment plants. I don't know a single community in my riding or any community in this country where you could maintain safe water drinking standards if you don't have adequate systems. So we have a situation now that under this government, despite all the consultations that had gone on, we have now, according to the National Assessment of First Nation Water Systems in their April 2011 release, that 39% of the First Nation communities in Canada are high risk. High risk. When you mention high risk, that means people can die. 34% of these communities are at medium risk. So what we're looking at here is a bill that's going to transfer liabilities basically to the Bantu stands and the shanty shack towns of the far north and say, you fix it, without doing anything to ensure that those people who are Canadian citizens of this country, have any of the resources that any other Canadian would take for granted. This is what this bill's about. When you think that in 2011, with the kind of money that this government was going to blow on the F-35, that they would tell 39% of the communities and First Nations, you can remain at high risk. But you know what? If you don't have the training, if you don't have the money to fix it, we're going to come after you. That is what is about this system of systemic negligence that has gone on in this country and continues to go on. Whether you're talking about health services, whether you're talking about policing, whether you're talking about education, it's a systemic system of apartheid that has been set up and maintained. That there's a standard of 2 levels of people in this country. That when you have 39% of the communities at high risk because of their water is dirty, and you have a government that says, now it's going to be your responsibility. That is absolutely intolerable. So what the government's sleight of hand is to say, we're going to set the standards, but we're not going to put the money in place. What's been identified to deal with the shortfall right now is $146 million. That's what's needed. It's dollars and cents that's needed to actually get these water treatment centers up to any kind of standard. It's going to be $4.7 billion over the next 10 years to maintain, and with an annual maintenance cost of $419 million. That's what this government needs to do. This bill is not the standard. What needs to be is in the throne speech. What we need to see is a throne speech that says from the government of Canada that the days that we're going to maintain these fourth worlds in northern Canada, that it's going to end. And we're going to put the funding in place, and we're going to put the training in place. Because I'll tell you, I've been in the communities where people have said, we want the training. And let's look at this Bill S8 in terms of a practical example. Martin Falls First Nation is right beside the Ring of Fire. Now, the federal government, the provincial government, they're just licking their chops to get their hands on the Ring of Fire. They're saying, oh, the Ring of Fire, it's going to be the greatest thing. Dalton McGuinty thinks it's going to actually restore his economic credibility once he gets his hands on the Ring of Fire. The federal government's saying the Ring of Fire, this is going to be the oil sands of Ontario. Well, Martin Falls is a little community that's right beside the Ring of Fire. They've been on a boiled water advisory since 2005.
That's a shame.
2005, 7 years. It's just considered normal that a community just has to boil its water year after year after year. The difference is now is Health Canada's decided they spend a little too much looking after Martin Falls, so they're suspending the bottled water going into the community. They've decided they're not going to do it anymore. Meanwhile, This is a little community that's sitting beside what will be probably one of the richest mineral developments in this coming century, and they're having the bottled water cut off. Now, how does that relate to Bill S8? Well, actually, it relates in a very clear way that we can explain to people back home. The community's been concerned. I remember when they were asking for help when the sewage lift was hit by lightning, and they said to Indian Affairs, listen, we do not have within our little community the resources to fix this, but you need to come in, fix this, work with us. Well, Indian Affairs didn't want to spend the money, so what happened was, of course, the sewage overflowed, the water system was contaminated. Now the government's saying, you know what, we're tired of this situation in Martin Falls, we're just going to put in a reverse osmosis water system and we're walking away. But at the same time, they've commissioned a study to find out how to fix the problem in Martin Falls, how to fix the sewage, how to fix the water. But they don't want to wait for the study. And the band is saying, listen, we want clean drinking water for our community. We want to work with the department. But wouldn't it be prudent to actually get the report, find out what works, and then put the money in to ensure that it works in the long term? Because what we see on First Nations again and again and again is the federal government always does what's cheapest, what's always quickest, whatever Band-Aid they can put on the septic wound, and then walk away. And then when the Band-Aid fails, they turn around and blame the community. So the community has raised legitimate, serious questions about whether a reverse osmosis system would actually work in their community because of the heavy level of turbidity in the water, the amount of bacteria that sits in the tank, that it is not a system that's going to work. So they're asking the department, you know, this is not necessarily have to be adversarial, they're just saying to the department, work with us. But the department's saying, thanks to some functionary at some level who's decided, no, this is how we're going to go, take it or leave it. And Bill S8 will allow the government then to hold the community accountable if something goes wrong, because it would have been now it's the community's responsibility, even though the community was not able to participate in the decision making. Mr. Speaker, I think I've had probably 12 or 13 states of emergency in 4 communities that I represent since 2005. A state of emergency is not something easy to declare. It just doesn't happen. State of emergency happens when an entire community is put at risk. And it's interesting, the response in Ontario, emergency measures, if a municipality declares a state of emergency, what happens is they'll send in emergency measures Ontario at the provincial level, and they'll do an assessment immediately. And then once they've done that, they will set up plans. But what happens in First Nation communities when a state of emergency is declared, they have to call Indian Affairs, and Indian Affairs says, hell no, we're not paying. And then the province will say, well, sorry, you're on your own. That's happened again and again and again. I'll give you a few examples. Well, again, with the Saskatchewan evacuation, we had 2 evacuations in 1 year in Saskatchewan. In 2008, the entire sewage system in Fort Albany collapsed. It collapsed. We had thousands of gallons of raw sewage, actually human waste, piling up in people's basements. The department's response is tell the people just to keep staying there. They were actually staying in homes that the methane gas was coming up at such a toxic level that people were lighting candles in their basement to try and put the methane gas down. Exactly. The Indian Affairs Minister knew this. The department knew this. They had footage of it. They knew that those houses actually were in danger of blowing up from methane gas. And I knew the families, little babies in those houses. But you know what? They thought, hey, that's okay because we don't want to spend the money. So they did one Band-Aid solution after another because they didn't want to do it right. It was actually a private company that ended up flying in bottled water, a private company that flew in pumps. And this deadbeat government didn't want to pay any bills. At the same time, we had the ongoing rebuilding in Saskatchewan from the floods there. In 2009, we had a state of emergency declared in Attawapiskat from the sewage lifts collapsing there. So once again, you know, how is it you think of a community like on a stretch from Windsor to London, taking 3 or 4 communities where their entire sewage system and community after community just collapses to the point that thousands of gallons of human waste is pumping into people's basements. Well, that was happening in the James Bay coast between 2008 and 2011. And the government's response, of course, is blame the community. They the Prime Minister got up and he did his famous, oh, he gave those Indians $50,000 each, every man, woman, and child. What did they do with our money? That was the Prime Minister's response on the day when the Red Cross came in, International Red Cross, to help people in Attawapiskat. Of course, the Prime Minister didn't bother to say that they had put that price on the head of every First Nation child and parent in Attawapiskat based on overall spending over 6 and 7 and 8 year period. They never put that number on non-Native people.